And greetings, everybody. Welcome to the Evidence and Reasons for the Christian Faith video channel. You could see there is in the banner there a warning. This is going to be an obscenely nerdy show. And there's about half of the subscriber base that is here for the McLean stuff. Now, a lot is broken out about McLean. Obviously, I'm not in jail right now, which is more than I could say for maybe another creationist. Who might be headed there in a few days. Some of you may have heard that McLean threatened me with arrest and jail if I go to church on their property to try to even get communion. So there's a lot of news surrounding that. And there's so much news coming regarding that and so fast that I haven't been able to update the websites and the YouTube channels with all that's flowing, but it's getting a lot of attention and we would like it to get attention. So a little bit about this channel. This channel is to provide evidence and reasons for the Christian faith. About 65% of what we talk about here is creation science, intelligent design, and then maybe 10% archaeology, 15% Christian testimonies, and then whatever else is left. Tonight, we're privileged to have Dr. Daniel Stern Cardinale. He is a professor of professor of biology, but his background is in evolutionary biology, so this is going to be great. We are going to be covering a chapter that was written and published in a secular venue in Springer, a Springer Nature publication. It's not Nature, the journal, but it is. I don't quite know how Nature got into the. You'll see it in the book. That's just the name of the publisher. So we were honored. I want to point out this venue was not a biology venue or an evolutionary biology venue. It's for mathematicians and engineers, probably more toward the graduate level. So one reason we were excited about this venue being creationists, at least me and Dr. Sanford, I can't speak for Dr. Basener and Dr. Hossjer. We were excited because we felt we would have a little more freedom talking to in a venue geared toward mathematicians and engineers. So definitely this is going to be interesting because I don't know that we would have gotten as friendly a reception from the editor if it were, say, an evolutionary biology journal or evolutionary biology handbook. We did, however, try very much to stay within, to quote, evolutionary literature top tier, not obscure guys. Top tier guys like Joe Felsenstein and Richard Lewontin. So I think that really helped us to get through peer review. And just briefly, the reason I believe, and reasonable speculation, is Bll Basener and John Sanford published in the journal Mathematical Biology. It set records. Oh boy.
Uh-oh. You're back.
Hang on, I'm going to unfreeze this. Okay. I'm on a backup stream, guys.
There you are.
Okay, Sal, so sorry about the technical difficulties. I'm going to have to kill my primary stream.
Oh.
This is Murphy's Law at work. At the worst possible time, it's just gonna collapse everything, and I might have to restart one of my systems here. So, Dan, can you hear me?
You're good. You're totally good.
Dan, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay. So we're going to go up on our backup system here. That's why I started it. So Dan,
Always have a plan B.
Yeah, plan B right away. So why don't so that's pretty much the introduction to the article. So I just want to say we did recognize that it might not get through an evolutionary biology peer review, and looks like okay, we've had a policy then just to look at venues that might be a little friendlier. So this is actually really great that we have Dr. Dan here, and he can actually express his viewpoints, and we know I know up front we're going to disagree, and that's fine. I feel that it's
That's
important
okay.
that
That's
the
okay.
other viewpoint gets aired fairly. And just I wanted to say we don't know where this is going because this was a massive chapter in the handbook for mathematics and the arts and sciences. It's 70 pages.
Big.
So
Just a
just
lot.
depending if we find something interesting, we'll go down there. There's good the paper. I should have put it in the link description, and it is for after the show's over, I'll try to remember to put it in there for those who want to get tortured. So with that, Dr. Dan, why don't you just share your thoughts while I actually I'll try to listen carefully while I try to get my primary computer back up.
Yeah, sounds good. So, hi everybody. If you don't know me, I'm Dr. Dan. My channel is Creation Myths. I talk about creation science. Come on over, say hi. We have fun. And so I was thrilled to see this chapter. This really this is great because one of the thing that people on my side of this discussion are constantly saying to creationists and in particular creation scientists is, look, if your ideas have the goods, then publish. Like, that's how you convince people you're right. Go through peer review, publish in the the secular literature, rather than through like AIG or CMI or something, Answers in Genesis or Creation Ministries International. Like, publish outside of that group, among just mainstream scientists. So this is great. This is exactly what people like me have been saying for a long time. And my background, as Sal said, is evolution. I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I engage with creationists all the time, kind of on the side. And most creationists aren't going to do this thing, right? So if you look at the people at AIG, for example, even they're the professional creation scientists, people like Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson or Dr. Georgia Purdom, they're not doing this kind of writing for an audience that is outside of the creationist audience. So that's the first thing I want to say, is that this is great, and a lot of credit to Sal and Dr. Sanford and Dr. Basener and Dr. Hossjer for putting their work out there for the general consumption in the scientific community. That's really good. The second thing that I want to go into here just briefly is what I agree with in this chapter, and we'll kind of go through a little bit what the argument is. I'm going to lay out the argument in a few minutes as I understand it, just to make sure that I have it right. I want to make sure that I'm responding to what the argument actually is, and I'm not misunderstanding anything. So I'll get to that in just a minute. But a couple of big things that I agree with that's in here, starting with this idea of Fisher's fundamental theorem, which is something, getting into the math is not it's neither here nor there for this conversation, but it's a way of modeling population genetics and evolution. And so first thing is that this chapter is all about Fisher's fundamental theorem, and basically that it's not realistic. And I agree with that. It describes kind of an idealized scenario in where you have a population that doesn't truly exist in nature. It's similar to, if anyone is familiar with the concept of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which describes a population that is not evolving if it meets certain conditions. But those conditions are things that never occur in actual populations. Fisher's fundamental theorem is similar in that regard, in that it describes a population that is ideal in a certain number of ways, right? But those conditions don't exist in natural populations. So the starting point of like, you have this mathematical formula that you could show that it's like valid, right? But like the conditions that are required for that math to work don't ever happen in the real world. I generally agree with that. Yeah, like that's the case. And the concept here that this is dealing with is called fitness maximization. It's just how is a population's fitness going to increase over time? And that's really complicated. It's non-linear. It's not a smooth increase over time. We could just like observe this. So you often see fits and starts where fitness goes up and then the environment changes and it goes down. Something about the population size changes, for example, and that's going to complicate the rate of or the efficacy of selection. So maybe you could have very efficient selection and then it becomes inefficient and then it maybe gets worse or it gets better. Whatever the case is, it's not a smooth increase usually, right? So I agree with all that. Yeah, Fisher's fundamental theorem, it is complicated. And like it doesn't accurately describe real world populations effectively, right? The other thing that I want to say, to the extent that I understand it, I agree with it, is the math. Now, a lot of the math is like, I'm not a mathematical biologist. So some of this math was over my head. To the extent that I followed the math, I'm cool with the math. Some of it I didn't follow, but I think it is incidental. It is largely incidental to the case that is being made, at least some of it. I don't feel like you need to be able to understand each. There are lots of equations in here. I don't think you need to be able to follow each equation to follow the broader case that's being made. To the extent I could follow the math, I don't take any issue with the math that's here. So that's the first thing. The stuff I want to give everybody a pat on the back for just like doing this and point out the things that I'm on the same page with as Sal and the other three authors. Sal, you still with us? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, excellent.
Cool.
And just for the viewer's sake, the reason you don't see my image is I'm on a backup computer. The other one that has my camera is going haywire, and it still is. So thank you. And again, I do want to point out this was for a mathematical audience, and they will be. You could just throw equations out that have, if you've known mathematicians, you can just throw math out there that may not have any relevance to the real world. They will still be fascinated. They might actually be more fascinated with it, honestly. So, so for those of you that are reading this like an evolutionary biology paper, that's probably the incorrect lens to look at this through. And that's why there were tons of equations, even if they were marginally relevant. Because Bll Basener is a mathematician and Ola Hossjer is an award-winning mathematician. This was a book for mathematics and the arts and sciences. So you could expect there was a lot of math that maybe this just there for math lovers. So go on. Thanks, Dr.
So my ability to comment on this is not on the validity of the math. I'm going to take it at the reviewer's word that the math is valid. The math I could follow seemed good to me, but at some point it gets way out ahead of what I can follow. And I'm just going to say, you know what? They said it's fine. It doesn't matter to me one way or the other. What I can evaluate is the underlying evolutionary theory, right? So it's kind of the part that I can comment on is kind of upstream of the nuts and bolts of the math, right? It's like, okay, we're using the math to make an argument. What's the foundation and what's the structure of that argument for evolution? That's where my expertise is. That's what I can comment on. So the second thing I want to do, Sal, is I want to go through the argument as I understand it. And you tell me if I got it right, basically. Because I don't want to comment on a straw man of the case that you all made. I want to comment on whatever the actual argument is, right? I don't want to straw man you. So if it's okay, let me just take a minute.
By the way, I really respect you for that. There's been some people I interact with, I've had to ban them from the channel and break off communications because they will not allow me the courtesy that you are extending just now. So we'll go through it. You have the floor, sir.
So here's the argument, and I'm going to make it's 3 points basically the way this argument flows. And there's the way the paper breaks down is the first part. So the first part is basically Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection is not either, I don't want to say it's not correct, because you actually do say the math works, but it's not realistic. It doesn't describe how actual evolutionary processes work. So that's part one of the argument. And that takes up a big chunk of this paper. This is easily the first half of it is just that, right? It's Fisher is not a good way. Fisher's fundamental theorem is not a good way of describing real world populations in terms of how their fitness does or does not increase. The second part of the argument is that fitness, as used by evolutionary biologists to mean reproductive success compared to other individuals in the population, right? Just how good are you compared to everybody else? That's your fitness, right? What's your relative contribution to the offspring in the gene pool of future generations? That's a bad way to define fitness. A better way to define fitness is based on functional complexity, kind of overall functionality within a genome or an organism. Basically, what can you do in the context of your environment? That's a better way to define and describe fitness than reproductive success. And that's the second part of the argument. And then the third part, kind of the way this wraps around, is saying, okay, if we show the math and we go through all the math to show that you can't maximize your fitness. And also, fitness should be defined as functionality or complexity. Sal, what's a phrase that you would like for the proposed definition of fitness here? Is there a snappy phrase that you prefer?
It is adaptiveness to operate in an environment. So it doesn't have to be a biological organism. For example, an airplane is fit to operate. It's adapted to operate in the air. And this is a thing that will go, we had thrown it in the paper. We were not actually proposing an alternative. We were just more or less suggesting. So the other thing is the biophysicists have kind of articulated kind of metrics for adaptation. So if you have an eye that's out of focus is not adapted. And we have all this stuff in geometric optics that can determine whether. And same
so
for
I'm just trying to so a phrase that I can use that you understand and everyone kind of understands what we mean when so for the proposed definition of fitness, can I call it would functional complexity be a fair way of describing that?
Not even that, because a lens isn't particularly functionally complex, but like a lens system.
Oh, functional. Yeah. Just function. How about just functionality?
No, not even that. But you're fair to criticize that we didn't really formulate an alternative. We had suggested it. And what we had done was basically, we quoted Lewontin, and he said, and there may be others we could have quoted, but we focused on Lewontin. He said, it's not entirely clear what fitness in the evolutionary sense is. And we left it at that.
Okay.
Then we proposed. So it's not that we were trying to echo what people like Lewontin themselves had, and I don't know if there was a reference to Andreas Wagner maybe in one of the versions. I don't know if it made it to the final cut because there's so many references. I can't even remember what version got published.
I know that section leaned pretty heavily on Lewontin. I don't recall any other specific references, but that section did lean on Lewontin.
Yes.
So I'm just looking for.
Yeah. So
I'm just trying to think. Would it be? I'm just trying to land on. Oh, go ahead.
It's fair to say we didn't make a rigorous case for an alternative definition. So this is, there's a saying, you can't build your own house by burning down the other guy's house. In this case, we were just kind of burning down someone else's house and not really building our own alternatives. So if you characterize it that way, I think that would be fair, because that it would also be fair to say that even I or none of the authors have really come up with a really rigorous approach. It's an ongoing discussion. So
So I
yeah.
So
We
for
were just
tonight,
pointing out Lewontin stuff.
would it be okay if I called it a maybe like a functionality based definition? Would that be close enough, just so we have a shorthand for tonight?
You really
Sal,
got me stumped here, Dan. I don't like the idea of. I like the word adaptive. Adaptive.
Okay, an adaptive and a
physically.
So because
adapted in the engineering sense.
Right. So that's where I'm kind of have a block with calling it an adaptiveness, because that has like fitness has a very specific definition in evolution, right? So how about we call it can we say like
designed adaptiveness?
Okay, let's call it let's call designed adaptiveness.
Maybe no. This is a good conversation.
Functional adaptiveness.
How about adapted an adapted architecture?
Adapted architecture. There we go.
Right.
That's a great phrase.
So the lens of the eyes are not necessarily complex, but the architecture of the lenses has to be right so that light is focused. And that's not necessarily complex. It's just the idea that it's right. And the physicist will tell you. So that is adapted in the architectural sense. So I like
adapted architecture.
Architecturally adapted.
Architecturally adapted. That's good. Okay, so I'm writing that down. So we've got architecturally adaptive.
Actually, this is a very productive discussion.
This is great. So this is good, because that's so that's the kind of, there's a part in the paper right in the middle there. So there's the big beginning part, right? That's all the math that Fisher doesn't accurately describe real populations. Then there's the next part the next part of the argument is that fitness should be defined, and we're going to say, as architectural adaptiveness.
And can I ask you one thing, Dr. Dan? Since
you
teach intro biology, was the basic genetics, when we were going over Mendelian inheritance and stuff,
So I was good with the basic genetics. There was one specific thing that was wrong in a couple of places. I wasn't going to even bother with it because it was not relevant for like the large scale argument, but there's a conflation between two opposite pop gen phenomena that you are not the only ones to have made this error. It's a very common error, but it's a population genetics reviewer would have caught it.
Okay, but I'll tell you why. There are three of us that are mathematicians. We're not very good in genetics. Right. And guess who wrote the genetics section? It was me.
There you go.
Not Dr. Sanford, which is ironic, but that's just
Well, actually, so the part that I'm referencing, it's actually an error that he makes in Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome. So it came from, like, it's very similar.
Okay.
Like the wording is very similar to what he uses, and he does the same. It's the same switcheroo that he does, where he confuses two things. But anyway, yeah, that's
like when you see like the Mendelians, the three laws of Mendel, and then
that was fine.
Okay, thank you. Because actually. We almost submitted one and it had some really bad errors. I'm just like, can we have another month on this? Because I need to make sure I don't make really terrible diagrams of like the chromosome and stuff. It was a mess.
No,
okay,
I think that part
that means a lot.
That part seemed okay.
Okay.
So the third, we've got, part one, Fisher doesn't hold up. Part two is fitness should be, again, architecturally adaptive, right? That's fitness. That's what we should be using. Now, part three, the third part of this argument is the therefore. This is the part with the punch, and this is at the end where you kind of get into, even before the formal conclusion, kind of start getting into like the implications. And this is where like the discussion of Lenski is, and it's the argument is that we show mathematically, you can't maximize fitness, right? And that means that evolution has a problem increasing complexity or overall functionality. And the Lenski experiment was used as kind of an example here to illustrate this disconnect between the consensus definition of fitness and the redefinition of fitness, because in the Lenski experiment, very famously, all those bacteria got better over time. All 12 lions have increased their fitness, but they've done so by actually losing a number of genetic traits that they don't need in that particular environment. So the third part of the argument was, we've shown mathematically that fitness doesn't maximize, right? Fisher doesn't work.
Oh,
go ahead.
It's a little more subtle than that. So there are two lines under Fisher's theorem with mutations, which Bll Basener advocated.
Mm-hmm.
It will not maximize if you have enough mutations, but
right.
It was important that I showed that there's no guarantee of maximization that was demonstrated by Patrick Moran. And I specifically cited Joe Felsenstein's book.
Mm-hmm.
So a little bit of the phylogeny of the lines of thought here.
Mm-hmm.
So Bill and John were really focused on Fisher's
Sal,
theorem.
can we,
sure.
before we get into kind of the genesis of the argument, let me just wrap up stating what my understanding of the argument, and then correct me if I have it wrong, and then we can kind of dig in from there. Is that okay?
Okay, go ahead.
So part one, Fisher doesn't hold up, and I actually largely agree with that part. Part two, fitness should be defined with this kind of engineering-based definition of fitness. And then part three is, since we have a difficulty maximizing fitness, we therefore, evolutionary processes therefore, have a problem. We have a problem explaining through evolutionary processes increases in complexity, which we know need to have happened through, the history of life on Earth, if it evolved from a, if we have universal common ancestry from a, prokaryotic, heterotrophic, anaerobic, universal common ancestor. How's that for a 3-sentence summary of the argument you're making?
I don't think we were actually, we wanted to be guarded in our language, even though kind of the implication is that's where we were headed. We didn't want to connect the final dot there because.
Right.
Okay. So
that came through in the reading. Yeah.
Is that fitness maximization is not a robust biological principle, was the last line in our abstract. So if you said that was where we were definitely headed, I would say I would agree. But in the strict sense, I don't think we collectively wanted to say, let's not overstep, let's not overplay our hand. Clearly, we wanted to lay that case out, the possibility of that case, and we were just laying that out. I don't think we were trying to connect the dots for the reader at the very end, because I don't think that would have flown if we said this is all wrong. So you can totally say, okay, if that was your kind of intended argument, you could still criticize that, because I openly admit that's where we were headed.
Okay,
but
cool.
As far as the paper itself, we didn't take that final step.
Yes. Right. So what I'm kind of doing by stating the argument that way is I'm reading between the lines as an evolutionary biologist that is immersed in this. So there are phrases that I read that I'd be like, that's John Sanford, and what he's describing is genetic entropy, even though he hasn't said it, right? I can pick out the parts where what's being described is genetic entropy, right? I can see in the argument where that is, even though it's not being stated, genetic entropy, blah, 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 right? He's not explicitly making the case as he makes it in Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome, but that paragraph, right, be like, I've read that argument before. It's the genetic entropy argument, right? So what I'm doing in formulating this argument with these 3 steps is I'm at the end reading between the lines of the intent of what was written, even though it wasn't explicitly said. Is that fair?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's fair. And so, what we tried to say is, how far could we make the argument where, people will say, okay, that's in the evolutionary literature. And we kind of suggested it. So it's in this discussion today, it's fair game to point out what you think the ultimate argument is that's kind of unstated between the lines, and you can criticize that. but
Gotcha.
it'd be helpful to point out, okay, did we actually say that in the paper that
Right.
explicitly as in his book? I think collectively
Yeah.
we said, okay, this is after all a reference book, meaning it's going to be on college bookshelves. By the way, you can even buy it at Walmart if you really want to. um, but
Yeah, I agree. The
felt
answer to that last part is no, right? It wasn't like, therefore, evolution has a problem. I think it was stated in a very kind of, I don't want to say roundabout way, but it was in a very circumspect way that, like, the implications for this may be that evolution, it may be difficult to explain certain increases in complexity through evolutionary processes. I think there was something along those lines in there, but it didn't go beyond that. Is that fair?
that was certainly our intent. Maybe our choice of words was not, sometimes we probably did overstep the bounds, but again, I felt this would be something that could fit in a college level library without, we didn't want to embarrass the editor. We didn't want to embarrass Springer Nature. And so we really were kind of at the bounds, let's say, of what we could say,
Right.
and still feel that we weren't going to embarrass the editor or the publisher.
So okay, so I think we're pretty much now on the same page in terms of what the argument was and was not. And then there's kind of the two levels. There's like what was explicitly stated and then what was kind of like intended but not stated. So if it's okay with you, I have kind of two big critiques that I want to talk about. If you think we've kind of set the foundation of now, it's already, so look at the time, it's already 9:40, and we're like, okay, we've established the foundation. Now we can start fighting.
Okay, so there is a little. I need to point out something.
Oh, go ahead.
And originally, John and Bill framed this whole the whole idea that Fisher was fundamental to biology's central theorem. That was from Richard Dawkins. Joe Felsenstein, I think,
that's wrong.
When Felsenstein saw that, he said, "No, we don't use it." And so I said, John, in this round, I think, let's not work from that premise. So in the Journal of Mathematical Biology, the math was right, but maybe the history was not quite accurate. In this round, I specifically said, John, let's add some other things, such as things from Joe Felsenstein's book that approach fitness maximization from a different angle than just Fisher's theorem. Because I said, if we're going to make a case now, especially now that Joe Felsenstein had critiqued your first paper, we have to kind of broaden this and at least show that we responded to his criticisms. And by the way, we received them, and Bll Basener is very gracious to hear them out. So it's it may appear, because Fisher's theorem dominates so much of the print space, that our argument was solely based on Fisher. So my contribution was to say, no, it's broader than that. Fitness maximization is, and it was a paper that actually Bll Basener found, it can be, the problems with it are independent of Fisher's theorem. So I just wanted to clarify that we had other lines of argument that fitness doesn't always, it's not guaranteed to maximize.
Yes.
Okay.
I agree with that statement. I want to make clear to everybody, I agree with that statement. Fitness is not guaranteed to maximize. That is accurate.
And by the way, that was really the central focus, from the title of the paper, Fitness Maximization. So we can kind of put a check mark on that goal, which is to survey the literature and say it's not going to maximize. And actually, the editor was probably surprised to hear that, because he's a mathematician. He's not a population geneticist. Okay, so go ahead. Now you can go. So
ahead. That actually was great. That actually gets into my second thing. So I'm going to come back to that. But the first thing is kind of what you just described, and kind of you actually have a part of this in the chapter itself, because a lot of the math is Fisher, like explaining Fisher, and then the Basener and Sanford kind of revision to Fisher from 2018, right? The first thing is, I'll just point out that as an evolutionary biologist, taken evolutionary biology, teach evolutionary biology, went to grad school, studied it. Like, this is what I do. The oh, I can see your face again. That's delightful. So Fisher's fundamental theorem did not come up once in any of that. So like I have right in front of me here, I have the textbook that I actually use. I actually don't use this textbook technically anymore. I mean, I recommend it, but I've gone mostly textbook free at this point, but I did in the past use this textbook as the basis for a class I taught. This is Evolution, Making Sense of Life by Zimmer and Emlyn. This is the first edition or the second edition. I think they're up to the third by now. Fisher is in this book, but Fisher's fundamental theorem is not. Fisher is in this book in other contexts. I also have right here, handy with me, I have Evolutionary Analysis by Freeman and Heron, fourth edition. This is the book from when I was an undergraduate. So this is the 2007 edition. Fisher's fundamental theorem is in this book for 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph explains it, and the second paragraph is about an experiment that showed how it's not realistic. And then it's gone. And that's it.
And I'll add, Dr. Dan, Felsenstein's book didn't have Fisher's theorem in it.
That was it.
And then I
said,
Joe, where is that? He said, oh, thank you for pointing that out, Sal. This is in 2015. He said, let me add it. So
yeah,
if you it's a fair criticism to say, why did we pursue it? It's because I think let's
see.
We were under the impression, because Fisher said it was fundamental.
Yeah,
and
this is
he's like one of the founders of neo-Darwinism, and so we accepted him on his word.
Fundamental. It's not that fundamental. Yeah, it does. Yeah. So I mean, and for people who don't know, Joe Felsenstein's book, it's Theoretical Evolutionary Genetics, is like the graduate level kind of evolutionary genetics book you're going to use, and it's just like it's not in there. So
I mean, that's a fair criticism. But again, this was a math venue. Okay, so
right. And the math is interesting. The math is interesting as all heck. Math is great. It's just it's not in terms of being like a pillar of evolutionary biology. Fisher's fundamental theorem is not part of it. It's just not a thing. And I know was it Dawkins is like, yeah, Fisher's fundamental. Like, I don't care what Dawkins says about population. I don't care. I don't care about that man's opinion.
He actually said it's biology's central theorem, not just population genetics.
Yeah, that's not true. There's a lot of things he says that aren't true, and that's one of them. So there you go. Okay, so that's my first critique, and it's not huge for the argument as a whole, because like you said, there are other approaches to maximizing fitness of like, how does this work, right? And you do address some of those other things. But so my second critique is kind of what you were kind of alluding to just a few minutes ago, and it's these other approaches, and specifically a lot of the experimental evidence that you referenced. There's a lot of on the Lenski long-term evolution experiment and reductive evolution in that context. And it's kind of two different arguments, I think. And the conclusion that is implicit is the connection between the two halves of the argument is not clear to me. So the first half of the argument is the very mathematically rigorous side of the argument. It's here's what should happen in this idealized population. But this math is unrealistic. Here's a more realistic mathematical model, right? The fundamental theorem of natural selection with mutation, right? Here's the more realistic version. And you do that math, and now what happens with the original model, the simplified version, doesn't work anymore, right? It's not that simple story, right? So there's that argument that like, and there's other mathematical approaches to that same thing. And I want to actually credit the authors on doing a really good job of kind of parsing like the utility versus the accessibility of models, that as models get more complex and better at describing the world, they also get necessarily harder to understand. So you have like, you kind of have to find that sweet spot of like, does a decent job explaining things, but is also like easy enough to understand. And like, it's hard to be right in there. And they show, right, you and the other three, you show basically that like for whatever models you have, you can mathematically model populations, and the specific claim, and I forget the exact wording, but it was something to the effect of the more realistic the parameters, right, the conditions in terms of things like mutation and genetic drift and non-selective processes, then the harder it is for that population to reach not even necessarily fitness maximum, but just an equilibrium with mutations as they occur. I'm butchering the exact wording, but that was the kind of the gist of it.
Can you say that again?
It was that as
and by
models,
the way, guys, just to Dr. Dan's credit, this is a 70-page paper. So, I mean, if you can't find the exact phrase, I don't know that I could.
No, I actually probably can find it. I have a, oh, I found it. I just found it's on page 43. It's the last line of the first paragraph on page 43. It's the paragraph that overhangs from the previous page. The line is, the more realistic the parameters employed, the more certain is the net decline. So basically you have your simplified models where fitness increases, but as you get more and more realistic in terms of the parameters, then what you see is it doesn't just not maximize, but it also ultimately declines. I got problems with that statement, but that's neither here nor there, because this is one half of the argument, right? So this is the first part of the argument. And then the second part of the argument is the fitness should be something other than reproduction side. And that's where you get into, like, look at Lenski, and it's they increase their reproductive abilities, but they're also losing a lot of genes from their genome that they don't utilize in that environment. So are they really more fit? Is that the proper way to define fitness? And then the kind of the bridge between them, the conclusion is the therefore, and this is kind of the implied part. It wasn't stated as explicitly as I'm saying it, but the implied part was therefore we have a problem. I want to be very circumspect about how I say this. Therefore, evolutionary processes have difficulty explaining certain increases in complexity, right? So it's that bridge. The problem is we have the two sides of that bridge are not adjacent to each other. You've got one side that's dealing with mathematical models that use I'm going to say the correct definition of fitness, the mainstream definition of fitness as it's been defined since the 1860s. And then on the other side, you have the arguments using the redefinition of fitness, right? Like the architectural adaptiveness definition of fitness. And then the therefore is saying, because this definition doesn't work, this thing is unlikely to happen, or we have difficulty explaining this thing. And it's an apples to oranges, like the two sides of that argument are not symmetrical. It's apples and oranges, where one thing you've got a very particular mathematical definition using the correct definition of fitness. And on the other side, you've got the redefinition of fitness that's engineering, it's structural, it's functional, right? It's different from what those mathematical models are describing, whether they do it well or not, right? That's my primary thing here. Again, as someone who doesn't comprehend a lot of the math, but I do get the evolutionary theory, the primary problem I have is the two sides of the argument, or I guess if we're going to be like formal about it, the two premises are kind of in different realms, right? You've got one that's very mathematically rigorous, but it uses the correct definition of fitness. Then you have the other one that, to your credit, you all cite a lot of experimental evidence, like direct observations showing reductive evolution. But then you can't connect those two things. You can't connect the mathematical models to the reductive evolution because they use the other definition, right? So that's where I lose the argument. So okay. Does everyone follow that? Does that kind of make sense?
Oh, well, okay. No. I think those are, it's incumbent on the authors to try to make their arguments as clear as possible and to kind of help the readers not misunderstand what they're saying. And so your inputs here are telling us if we,
did I miss the boat? Did I miss? Oh no.
No, because honestly, they were so, the team was like, okay, this is going to be a mathematical presentation. We're going in kind of the territory toward the end of, because we felt it was important just to tie up loose ends, kind of in the philosophy of biology, which is, again, do we define adaptation in terms of reproductive success or in terms of architectural adaptation? And so, so like when they said, in short, mathematical models show that fitness maximization is not happening, as more realistic factors are considered, ongoing decline in fitness is due to mutation accumulation becomes increasingly likely. It's not necessarily inevitable. That's page 42.
Yeah, and I agree. I just want to see if I can find that
Page
phrase, because
42,
I agree with
conclusions
that
from
phrase.
mathematical mutation selection models. And by the
yeah,
way,
here we go.
I like that wording. He said more likely. It didn't say absolutely. So you could
I
tell that
100%. Yep. Yeah.
So the authors, there's tension here because John likes to say, "Oh, definitely, it's going to genetically deteriorate." I'm on the more circumspect side and say, can we just say more likely? You keep us out of trouble, we'll have a better chance of defending the paper. So language like that is, so every now and then it might slip out. We might make an absolutist comment, just like, we need to be more circumspect. So if you find phrases like that, it's like, okay.
So I will say, the note I have right here next to this line, I didn't highlight that line, but I made myself a little note in the margin. I wrote to myself, and this is a direct quote, not going to say genetic entropy, but that's the argument.
Yes.
Right.
I wanted to give more circumspect.
Yeah.
And I was insistent. I said, I know, John, you're really passionate about genetic entropy. I said, but we're not going to serve the publisher well if we just make this a genetic entropy talk.
So I will say for everybody, I disagree. I like that wording in that it's very this is how scientists write. It's very conditional. It's very circumspect. It's kind of tentative. This is how science is written, right? We're not going to say like this for short. We're going to say under these conditions, this is what we expect to happen more frequently versus less frequently, right? I will say I disagree with this for a couple of reasons, but that's not the point of what we're talking about tonight, because assuming that, let's call that one, that's one of the premises of the argument, right? It's the connection between that and then the problems of increasing complexity, where I think it's the equivalent of, if I can draw an analogy, Sal, I don't know if you've ever done this on exam, but I did this on a biochem exam one time, and I got away with it. And I was like, yeah, it's when it was a whole thing, and I didn't remember the whole pathway, but I knew like the first half of the pathway and like the kind of the back bit of the pathway. And then somewhere in the middle, there was a step or two I couldn't quite remember on the exam. And I just kind of fudged it. And the TA who was grading the exam missed the fudge and gave me full credit, because it was just like, and you get this molecule, and then the next one, it wasn't quite right. And it was close enough that the two kind of together in the middle. And I feel like that's what's going on here with this argument. We have the very rigorous math, right? And I disagree with the conclusions of the math. I disagree, for example, with the distribution of fitness effects that are used, but put that aside. You can have the math and just assume, it is what it is on its face, right? We could spend 3 hours talking about how realistic that distribution is, right? And just we just go to town on it. But put that aside. You have that math and it tells you stuff under whatever conditions, right? And that's what the page we were just talking about is discussing. On the other side of things, you have actual biochemical and genetic traits, stuff that cells do. And there's a muddle in the middle there between these two arguments, where you have rigorous math, experimental evidence, but they don't join in the middle neatly, right? Has anyone ever seen that picture? I think it's a Photoshop, but it's still funny. If people building a bridge and they line up like this, like the two roadways, right there, that's what's going on in the middle of this chapter here, I think.
I would say that's a fair criticism, and I'll tell you why. Remember I said this is getting to be a 140-page paper? Guess what they cut out? Guess what we had to cut out? It was that bridge, and it's partly because, this really was Bill's baby, the Fisher's theorem, and we were getting into some some more of the genetics and biophysics, and just like, okay, these are math students. They may not have had any cellular biology. And so the decisions, so I would say that's a very fair criticism. And it's not because we didn't think about it. It's like,
Right.
okay, we have 70 pages. And that was just, oh, by the way, announcing this to the readers.
Right.
That is the substance of an upcoming paper. We took pieces of this paper that made the, went on the cutting room floor. And there are a number of papers that, one paper already got published in an ID-friendly journal, Blythe, but we're trying to push that. So,
well,
Dr.
I will be excited to read that, because I think that's I think that's a really hard case to make. I really do, because you cite Lenski, for example, right? And this is like the thing that creationists bring up with like reductive evolution. You cite, well, you got Lenski, and the fitness increased, but they jettisoned a bunch of their genome. They lost their flagella, right? Because like you all mentioned this, they're in a shaking flask, right? So like you don't need a flagella. You just move through the environment anyway because it's being shaken. So like that flagella is a waste of energy. Yeah, go ahead.
Sandy Pigeon just showed up in the chat, and he said, check your email. Can I do this? Because I'm worried about some legal actions being taken on me.
Oh yeah, check your call your office. Yeah, definitely check your email.
Oh, okay. Not to do with me. I'm a free man for now.
All right, we're good. All right, cool.
I'm not like that other creationist who may be going to jail in a few days.
What's going on there?
Thanks, Andy.
Okay, so I think in this. Oh, go ahead.
No. Actually, what you can you just, for my benefit, what you said is there's a disconnect between like, what was the disconnect again? And I'm sorry, I'm being dense.
No, absolutely.
Okay, so my old age.
So for me, the disconnect is between like the real rigorous math on the one side, right, in the first half of the paper. And you could agree or disagree about the parameters and the assumptions that go into that, like the distribution of fitness effects and stuff. But the math is what it is. And you can make a case based on that math, right? And on the other side of that, you've got the reductive evolution complexity kind of side of things. And the conclusion made more or less explicitly in different parts of the paper is that because of this problem with maximization over here, that implies that evolution has a difficult time explaining complexity over here. And then in support of that, there's the evolutionary, the experimental evidence of reduction in things like the Lenski experiment. And those two things don't match because you're using different definitions of what you're increasing, right? On the one side, you're talking about reproductive capacity. And on the other side, you're talking about whatever, the architectural adaptiveness, right? Two different things that you're talking about increasing that don't always correlate with each other. And I'll say often don't correlate with each other. So maximizing one or being unable to maximize one is not informative about your ability to increase or decrease the other.
So to that end, what it did end up on the cutting room floor tried to address that partially. And we have another paper. So it was on the cutting room floor, actually got published in the Blythe, where I said, okay, you can have architectural adaptation. I didn't use that word, but now you helped me coin that word.
No, I like it.
So
use that term instead of fitness, and people are going to be a lot less mad at you.
Okay, this is already very productive at this point. But I pointed out, let's say loss of function. It can be a beneficial mutation.
Oh yeah.
And I did point that out in the Blythe paper. I said this is. I cited the experiments. The observation by Alan Orr when he's critiquing Daniel Dennett. He said natural selection doesn't trade in the currency of design, which again is that disconnect. Sometimes you can have a loss of function that ends up being reproductively more successful, like in Gamera's minus, which is like a kind of, it's a blind crustacean, not a cave fish. I only
I mean,
learned that.
you see that in a lot of things. You see that. I
Yeah.
mean, the cave example is a great one because you have loss of eyes in parallel across, dozens of lineages, right? And
So you know what? I'm just going to say, the way that you understood it was probably something collectively the four authors could have tried to clarify. And so I accept that criticism. I'll own that.
I appreciate that. So now I'm really looking forward to the follow-ups to bridge that gap, because that job I think is really hard, because for every experimental example of something like Lenski, where you have a population that has loss of function over time correlated with an increase in reproductive success, I think you could point to tons of examples of increasing complexity, both in the real world and in experimental populations. So
and I think that's going to be an interesting. I think this is going to be very difficult, as you said, and at most in our upcoming paper, also with John Sanford, is we'll just make a theoretical case, because to survey all the experiments and everything that's ever happened under the sun, I think that would be very prohibitive to say, okay, what's the exact proportion of increase in complexity versus loss? I said, no one's going to come up with that number in a comprehensive sense.
I don't think you need to come up with a proportion. I think to make your case, you would just need to show that I'm trying to think how I would go about making the case that you can't get the large scale increases in complexity. And
I'll tell you what we're going after, and this is just well,
please.
because we're going to go. We're very close to submitting to an editor.
Nice.
And we might as well get some free peer review from.
Yeah, let's do it.
We're arguing for specific classes of complexity. We're not going to. I said, creationists, stop arguing complexity in general. Just identify the cases you think that are challenging, and it's not going to be any surprise. We're arguing that it's difficult to create new multimeric proteins.
New multimeric proteins. Okay, so what specifically do you mean? I love this. Is like a really cool step, because so when I think of this, like just so everyone's on the same page, like what are we observing happening like in nature right now, right? And you could be like, you're getting reproductive adaptations in reptiles where they're getting placentas kind of independently of mammalian placentas. Lots of examples of endosymbiosis going on right now, which is like ridiculously complicated process. Tons of interactions and protein trafficking and DNA trafficking between compartments for endosymbiosis to work. But like we know, there's at least one animal that has a gene for photosynthesis in its nuclear genome due to transfer, right? So like these are really complicated processes. And my kind of thinking is, well, if we could observe something that involves that many steps, that many interactions, then it's reasonable to think anything simpler than that, right, could evolve through, like if we could observe it happening through natural processes, then anything below that kind of in complexity should be able to evolve.
I think that's a very compelling case, and that is because we do see like intergenerationally some developmental plasticity that is really amazing, where the population is under an environmental pressure, and then it seems to acquire adaptations that are just like, wow, the creatures look very different. And so what I've been saying is like, okay, let's just go down to let's argue from what we know.
So what do you mean by multimeric protein? What are we talking about?
Okay, so proteins that have to, the famous one is hemoglobin. And Thornton gave a phylogeny of why he thought like the myoglobin could evolve into just a few changes. Great paper. But he himself said that seemed very fortuitous, for one. So this isn't a critique of common ancestry. He echoed the sentiment that he said, this is amazingly, this is fortuitous. And I'd say amazingly fortuitous. And he echoed it. And even in that paper, he said, we have not had a good explanation for the origin of multimeric proteins. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact title of that, off the top of my head, but it was like a 2020 paper on evolution of multimeric proteins. It was hemoglobin was a specific case.
So proteins that, just so everyone's on the same page, we're talking about proteins that have more than one polypeptide chain. So 2 or more polypeptide chains that assemble into the final functional unit. Yeah.
So there, so specifically, we're citing like one of the multimeric proteins is obviously topoisomerase, because that's the one I've studied a lot with my colleagues. It has about 60 connections, and so we're trying to say, okay, look at all the connections that make this thing a reasonable. Maybe just like when you're connecting stuff, you don't need every screw to be there, but it's really helpful. So we can, it's very hard to see how the monomeric version could really be useful by itself. It works well, like in the case of topoisomerase 2-alpha as a dimer. And then we have the helicases that are, a lot of them are hexameric. We have some that are more complex, or like collagen, which is a heterotetramer.
That's
the insulin receptor.
Yeah.
So
yeah. ATP synthase
is,
has like how many parts, right? DNA polymerase is like 8 or 10. Like DNA polymerase has a bunch of different parts, right? It's all.
So we will say, okay, let's just accept common descent as a starting point, and you can even construct phylogenies that will describe that. The question is this still a highly probable scenario if we have a random walk? And we will make some arguments, both experimental. The reason we like topoisomerase, it's been well studied, and we actually try to disrupt its function. That's how we have a lot of chemotherapies for cancer. So we feel that paper would be at least good to point out in certain contexts. Like there's been a thing where in proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences are saying frameshift mutations could be an effective evolutionary strategy. We're countering and saying, well, maybe for small monomeric proteins, but you're not going to build a topoisomerase that way. You're not going to build a collagen or any system that has. And so are we trying to argue the most general thing? And I try to say, creationist ID proponents, stop trying to make these overarching claims that you're going to have to prove every little exception. Just focus on something smaller and build from that. So we could say, maybe we would say complexity of this sort.
Okay.
That involved.
So
we think that would be difficult.
So
okay, go ahead.
At risk of making your paper better and therefore my life harder, I'm going to make a suggestion.
Okay.
and the suggestion is focus on, like, I hear like we have this complex thing, the theory. How do you get, I think you meant, I forget which one, but you mentioned like 60 interactions between the different polypeptide chains.
Topoisomerase 2A.
Topoisomerase, 60 interactions, right? It's a lot of interactions. That's probably a really robust connection between the two chains. Rather than focus on like theoretical cases like that, I think, like, I'll already tell you, I'll read that paper and you'll go through the math on how like theoretically challenging it is to evolve the connections between the parts of a topoisomerase. And I'll just be like, yeah, but like this HIV protein VPU, it evolved into a pentameric pore in HIV, and it doesn't do that in SIV. So like it has a number of binding sites, kind of each polypeptide of the 5, right? It's got a number of sites, on the right and on the left that have to be compatible with the next one on the right? It's like a circle of 5 holding hands. So you have to have the right hand and the left hand. Those binding sites to each other don't exist in the ancestral SIV version. And like, this is, that's not theoretical. That's something that like we know it evolved because we know HIV has only been around for like about a century.
And we weren't specifically covering that. We were talking about frame shift. So we made it even narrower.
Specifically, yeah, that's not a frame shift. That's just,
no, but
that's
still,
just
to your credit, the more general question you point out, and I heard you discuss that with Michael Behe when he came on your show, and I think he was actually impressed with your counter, with the pentameric VPU, viriporin protein.
Yeah.
And I know kind of in the back channels we've discussed that too. So we can,
because that's a brand
that
new
would be good
example
homework
of
for
a
me. And like you said, at the risk of making your job harder, if we
right.
make a good paper.
If you can come up with a
But
reason why
I
that
will say
doesn't
this:
count,
this would be a good question for the ID side to say, okay, Dr. Dan has a point. And I think I wish our side would be more like, Dr. Dan has a point. Why don't you listen to him?
That example checks Behe's boxes for irreducible complexity, but he doesn't like to say that.
Oh,
but
by
like
the way,
it does.
Guys, if you want to know why I don't like the term irreducible complexity, it's because you have all these. I just like, didn't you see that exchange with Dr. Dan and Dr. Behe? About 45 minutes was trying to define what irreducible complexity is and what are all the exceptional cases. I said, guys, that's why you don't use that term. You can use it as a heuristic, but God bless Otangelo. I just like, dude, don't go there. Go with one example and work from that, because otherwise you're going to be hammered by a bazillion counterexamples and you're going to lose your debate. So
Sal, I have a question for you then, because I think if I can kind of game this out in my mind, you're talking topoisomerase 60-ish, interactions that hold those monomers together, or the polypeptides together. VPU, it's not that many. It's like a couple on each side. It's like, maybe, I don't know, 3, 5, 6, like it's not that many substitutions to get from SIV VPU to HIV group 1, HIV 1 group M VPU. It's not that many, right? So what I could see you all saying is, okay, but you have a threshold of complexity where, below that threshold, like a couple of interactions, that can happen, right? But 60, that can't happen. But I think the problem with that counter argument would be that you don't need them to all happen at once. All you need is that weak affinity once they start coming together. Now, if it's beneficial to be able to come together, obviously HIV exhibits huge amounts of variation, even within a single individual. So maybe you've got the ancestral form of this VPU viroporin has 2 connections on each side. But maybe it works better if there's 4 on each side and you slowly find those other more stable configurations. How, is the better place to end up at 10, 12, 15? Now, here's a wrench in that question. VPU also works elsewhere in the cell, but only as the monomer. So you don't want it to just by default smush together into the viroporin, because that's actually going to inhibit what it does elsewhere in the cell.
Well, this is very interesting. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
And to bring this back to what we were talking about before, this is why the architectural adaptation version of fitness, I think, doesn't work, because you have countless examples of stuff like that, where being well adapted, right, in an engineering sense, to do one thing makes you less well adapted to do something else that you also do. And where you end up, where you kind of balance those competing interests, where that pinpoint ends up, that's the evolutionary, that's the correct definition of fitness, of like, that's what you're selecting for, to maximize how good you are overall, not at degrading CD4 or grabbing onto and inactivating tethering, but how well as a whole you facilitate propagation of that particular HIV genotype, right? That's, to bring this back around, that's why the correct definition of fitness is the one that gets used, because it necessarily takes into account these competing interests of, can I be good at this or can I be good at that? Because I can't optimize both. Where's that balancing point? Well, you find the balancing point based on whose versions of those different genes end up most frequent in the next generation.
Well, this is where we're going to start to have some sharp disagreements, and especially because this is where we've actually been helped in that architectural adaptation is the biophysicists weighing in. And I don't know if you've seen William Bialec's lecture. I put it on in this channel, and he argues more perfect than we imagined. So
yes, I did see part of that. Yes, about like the resolution of the eye with like the physical. Yeah.
Yes. So it actually says, okay, what have you sacrificed to optimize this? So we have like a lot of engineering principles and said, okay, it's clearly optimized. We're going to sacrifice so much of this to get this, but we know that it's optimized to the limits of physics.
Right.
So,
Okay.
so to maximize flight, you have to be light. That means you're going to be a little bit more fragile. And we know that as an engineering principle. We're going to, it was really funny. My aerospace professor said, okay, we don't build airplanes like we build bridges. In bridges, we put factors of 15 in terms of like, we're going to design this so that, the bridge it needs to only carry this much. We're going to overload it by a factor of 15. So you don't do that in aerospace because your airplane won't fly. So in terms of general engineering principles, you'll see it's like, okay, there is, as you said, the trade-off. But what we can identify is what is the maximum performance in terms of physics? And then you'll build the system around that. So flight is a very good example. It's like, okay, you're going to make everything light. The hummingbird has only like one testicle. Okay, I don't know why that. It's like it's gonna try to save weight in every little piece, and you can actually see that it's very optimized for to be like those airplanes in World War II, like the Zero Fighter, just had nothing. It's
right. Just speed, an engine with a pilot, right? It was an engine with a pilot. Yeah, right.
So it's been nice to see now that the biophysicist has weighed in and said, okay, this is the limit of what physics will allow us to build, even in principle. It's like you could.
So can I bring this back around to the kind of the genetics and the biochem side, though? Because I think evolution has a way of getting around this, not in the physical sense, but if we're talking about like optimizing biochemical traits, like how to inactivate CD4 and tetherin at the same time. Well, those things are potentially antagonistic to each other as HIV, right? So you have this one gene that's doing double duty, and you're limited in terms of how well you can adapt to that. You can't do everything optimally. But we have a mechanism for that we can document extremely well that gets around that problem. You duplicate the gene, and now one of them specializes to inactivate tetherin. The other one specializes to deal with CD4, two different parts of the cell, two different functions. Now those functions are no longer antagonistic. And we haven't observed that in HIV, but we can make predictions about what genomes should look like and how things should interact with each other if processes like that happened. And that's exactly what genomes and cells and organisms look like, right? You see a lot of, like, for instance, in that situation, we have gene A and gene B, right? Gene A does this thing, gene B does this thing. If they share a common ancestor that did both things, we don't expect all of protein A to go into one place and all of protein B to go into the other place. We expect it to be kind of a leaky, messy system where, like, protein B is mostly over here, but some of it's over there messing with protein A, and protein A is mostly over here, but some of it's over there tripping over protein B, right? There's going to be crosstalk, there's going to be interference, there's going to be these leaky systems. And that's exactly what we see when you look at things like receptors, for example, where they're not perfect to their target molecules. There's a lot of leakiness in those systems. So a receptor, sorry, go ahead. I made the point. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, this is very interesting because we see a lot of gene regulatory networks where it actually, for lack of a better word, you try to amplify the concentration and then inhibit it. In engineering, we have a lot of feedback circuits that look like, it looks like, why don't you just get it right the first time? It's like, no, you need that feedback. We call it error signal measurement. And so there are a lot of things, even like, just take something as basic as error correction. It's like, well, why do you have errors anyway? Why don't you just make genomes that are perfect and you don't need to pull the polymerase error correction? Well, there's theorems in engineering where the optimal, if the design goal is for compactness, you have to use error correction. So we can actually, we're starting to see, it's like, okay, the DNA genome probably has just the right amount of errors expressed, and then the right amount of error correction. If the design principle were compactness.
But here's the thing with that. Is that an inherent property, or is that an evolved phenotype?
Well, I would say this is an open question. So for certain things like magnetic perception or electrical perception, we do know, the physicists have worked, they're more simple questions than the ones that you just asked. And the simple questions are like, okay, what's the optimal focusing of an eye? This is relatively easy. What is the optimal electric sensing? What is the optimal magnetic sensing? What is the, optimal way to count molecules? It's just, or photons. Those are actually relatively, and we can say these organisms are optimized at the extreme limit of physics. The questions that you raise, that you're pointing out, I don't think we'll have answers to that for a long time. So that's why what I was saying to creationists, don't make the broad claim that it's all optimized. I'm just like, you're
Right.
going to get slaughtered.
Well, it might be optimized.
Focus on individual things that are kind of bite-sized, and even that's kind of difficult. And then, that's about all we might tractably be able to work with. But at least we're making better creationist arguments than somewhat other creationists are making. At least we've gotten into some of the details, and maybe we'll just have to be satisfied with that. That I think sometimes, understandably, people want a complete answer to everything. I'm just like, yeah, your brain's not going to process that. I would rather we make a few good arguments that are not universal, but we can defend them. And that's about, that's my approach. I'm not like some of these creationist channels that say, oh, this proves everything. I'm just like, no. Okay. So
I appreciate the level of care that's taken to be precise in the way you make the arguments. So I think this is a good place to kind of put a bow on this one, and then we should definitely continue this conversation at a later date. I would love to keep talking about this because we could just do this.
By the way,
hours
and if you want to go over
but,
some of our peer-reviewed papers that we're trying to submit to publishers, we'll be going on to preprint servers first. Well,
you give me the link, I'll check it out. So what I want to say real quick with what you were just talking about is optimal, right, is context dependent, and mutation rates are such a good example of this, right? There's a mutation rate. You said it's an open question whether it's inherent or whether it's a phenotype. I don't think that's an open question at all. I think it's 100% mutation rates are a phenotype. And we know this because we can actually watch things adapt to different environments by changing their mutation rates. So parasites do this all the time, where they'll elevate their mutation rate in response to a host response. And that will to basically change up their surface makeup so they evade the host immune system better. But you can even see this in viruses, where certain viruses actually have there are sequences in their host that basically say, check me, start here. And it's a start site for DNA repair following replication, where they'll be like, okay, are we all starting at this site? Be like, okay, are we good? And those checkpoints basically occur at a predictable frequency in the host genome. And in the viral genome, they occur at a much lower frequency, if at all. And the cool thing is you can decrease the viral mutation rate by an order of magnitude if you put those sites in to the genome artificially. You can decrease the viral mutation rate. But if you do that, you know what happens over time? They evolve to get rid of them, because the higher mutation rate is actually beneficial in that particular context. So the broader point is that I think there are some things where you've got, a range of possible, right, in terms of biological systems, and the optimal is going to be somewhere in the middle of that range. You've got other contexts, like maybe vision or, whatever, these super precise things, where the optimal is going to be right at that threshold of what biological systems can accomplish. And because you have a mix, rather than everything is at that optimal threshold, the biophysical kind of optimal threshold, I think that's strong evidence that it's not universally just like design. It's No, these things are evolving, and some of them are evolving right to this threshold where you literally can't be more precise. And that's what I think there. But now we're kind of all into left field. So if you want to have the
oh no, this is a good
final
conversation.
point there, go ahead.
Let me just throw, since you put this on the table, not only is it the limit of biological systems, it's a limit of any system, period. And the reason there's enthusiasm in the design community is like with the magnetic field sensing of birds and also the electric field sensing of sharks, that's beyond anything even humans can engineer with their best science. And so there are people like Marcus Eberlin, who's a chemist like James Tour, has like 200 PhD students. And he's a very accomplished chemist in Brazil. And he is squarely on the design side because he's seen these things where it's like, we can't even do this in the lab with our best equipment. And we don't, the intuition is, we don't think an evolutionary process could arrive at solutions that good, because even when we try, we can't make it that good. So I will grant that there are a lot of messy systems out there. In fact, that's what genetic entropy is actually arguing, is there are a lot of messy systems out there. There are things that are degraded and that are no longer operating optimally, but we do see things still like the shark electric field sensing and the Arctic Terns magnetic field sensing that are at the extreme limits of physics. And it's just because I was in the aviation industry and building sensors. That's what electrical engineers do. From my side, this really plays well to my audience, so to speak, which are mostly engineers, not biologists. They're just like, wow, I've tried to build that and biology does it better. So I'm kind of one of the few that, and it's a hard career path to have been in the engineering and then also the biology. There are not many of us because it's hard to be even good at one profession. And I'm kind of like not so good at two. Okay, so if one wants to do biophysics, you have to kind of be not so good at two professions because each discipline is so insanely hard. And Biolec is like the only one of the few guys that are just like top tier. He's very good at both. So with that, so you had these, just to wrap up this round. I think we had your characterization of the paper, I think, was fair, and where it could have done better. I would totally agree, and I would just say, well, there's 70 pages that got cut out. Because this is a very large topic. I mean, we are under the constraints of what could we reasonably fit. Because I actually think that the questions you raised as far as the bridging and all are so big, there's no way we would have fitted in. And so if we got the impression,
should have had 2 chapters. They should have just given you another chapter and then
I know. We were thinking about asking for that, and I said, okay, we pushed the limits, but I think this is overall just a great conversation. I didn't have any issues with what you said, because these were things we said we wish we had the space to address, and also the opportunity to clarify what we at this time cannot make good claims about. And then so that led to okay, we didn't really define an alternative to fitness in the evolutionary sense. We just said, okay, Lewontin gave his ideas, which, by the way, I don't know if you've read the essay that we linked to for Lewontin. It's the 4 complications with evolutionary processes or something, Santa Fe 2003.
I had read that at some point as part of a seminar, but it was what year was it? 2020. It was probably about 10 years ago. Yeah. So it's been a little while.
By the way, I mean, if I had to say that was kind of the model, just a little history of the paper. This paper got dumped on my lap. Bill said, I don't have time to do it. Can you build it? I'm just like, no. and so the basic framework was really mine. That's why I got the privilege of being second author, not the third author. And so the framework that we were approaching it was basically the four complications of evolutionary theory by Lewontin, but particularly the fourth complication. We didn't do the first three. So if you're looking for the structure and the ideas that were conveyed, it was that paper plus the one by Grodwall. It says the theory was beautiful indeed, the rise and fall and circulation of fitness maximization. So basically the structure of our paper is mostly that. And then we threw tons of Fisher's theorem because that was Bill's baby for like 5 years. So we had to feature that. So this was a little bit of Frankensteinish paper, but yeah, I thought we managed to put in a lot of what I wanted. And I think that's a challenge one will run into when you have multiple authors. It's like, oh no, I want my idea in there. And it's like, no, I want mine. So, if you have any closing thoughts, I'll give you the last word. And thank you for your time. And maybe we'll have some more discussions. You might hear from me in the email. And I'm really glad to hear I'm not going to jail.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you. This has been super fun. Just, I mean, you advertised this as nerding out, and that's, I think we delivered. And I could, just sit here on a weeknight, just talking population genetics and evolution, and like, I'm in. This is great. I have so much fun with this. So second thing is I would love to continue this conversation. I will email you, you email me. We should keep talking about this because there's so much stuff in here that we could talk about. I want to talk about Grauer and the limits of functionality and how that plays into this. We could just, and I know we touched on that briefly in other contexts, but we've never sat down and like, we're going to talk about it. So I would love to do that at some point. Like that'll be super fun.
And maybe next time on your channel. And we'll just
I'd be happy to host. Yeah, happy to.
And by the way, you're free to, it takes about a day for YouTube to process this where you can duplicate it. I don't know why. I found that out. If you tried to download this like an hour after this closes,
it won't work.
It just does, it doesn't. You need to give it about 1 or 2. I found that out the hard way. So you're welcome to air this on your channel. So if,
thank you. I will down the road. I will get to that definitely at some point.
And if we can reciprocate when I'm on your channel, that would be great.
Yeah, it's great.
So maybe the next time we can talk about Grauer a little bit, because it was specifically in our paper.
Right.
I begged for it because I was, it was so dominated by Fisher. I said, but can we put the Grauer stuff in there?
Oh, but Sal, it breaks my heart. But you didn't reference the correction. There's a correction on that paper that like Grauer himself has been like, my math is wrong. It's not in. Yeah.
No, we will. I didn't. Well, that's fair game.
We're going to talk about it.
Yeah, we'll talk about it.
Well, anyway, so big picture thoughts here are we have math that argues one thing, and I largely agree with it. But then there's experimental biology that argues a different thing that I strenuously disagree with. And when I say I agree with the math, I agree with what the math shows, right? If you do, like the math is done correctly is what I agree with. I don't agree with all the conclusions because I disagree with some of the assumptions, or I'll say I disagree with some of the premises, but I accept that the math is valid, right? As you presented it. Then you've got the kind of experimental reductive evolution side of things. That I disagree with strenuously with the argument there. With the kind of,
that's going to be a fun discussion. Okay.
Oh, we'll talk about it. And then where they come together, I think, is the flaw of this chapter in terms of making the argument is that those two things, they miss each other. You can't base the second part on the math in the first part because they're talking about different things, right? That's where my, like, if there's one flaw for me, it's that the two halves don't connect. So that the ultimate conclusion that's stated openly in some parts, kind of more implied in other parts, but that conclusion of the difficulty of explaining complexity doesn't follow because the two halves of the argument are using different definitions. That's my 30,000 foot kind of elevator pitch response.
So, guys, stay tuned for more rounds of nerd.
We're gonna do this again.
We're gonna do this again. So Dr. Dan, thank you. And I'd like to thank all the viewers for joining us. And it's been a lot of fun. I'll see you backstage just briefly to say goodbye, Dr. Dan. And so this does it for tonight. Oh no, this does it for this show. At 12:30 midnight, we're going to have Rebecca, and I'm going to give her debate pointers because she's been showing up on another channel, and that kind of upset me. I'm just like, why are you going to waste your time there? You've got the #1 YouTube creationist here. You can hang out with me, and we'll show you how it's done. You know, I mean, so this is going to be after midnight, after the midnight hour. So stay tuned, guys. And Dr. Dan, a very heartfelt thanks for investing so much time in reviewing our paper and offering comments and criticisms. This is enormously valuable to me personally. You didn't have to do this, and you did. And so a heartfelt thank you. So take care, everybody.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Sal.